Welcome to the Indian Council of World Affairs, India's oldest foreign policy think tank.
Many people interested in foreign policy have told me when they come to the Indian Council of World Affairs in Sapru House, they feel a great sense of affinity with this institution because this was where the serious study of international relations in India all began.
The ICWA was set up by a small group of public intellectuals some years before our independence, because they felt it important that India have an independent perspective on international affairs. Since then, the ICWA has gone from strength to strength, and it has been a long journey, almost 75 years. One particular milestone in that journey was in 2001, when the Indian Parliament passed an act declaring the ICWA to be an institution of national importance. We thus became a publicly funded independent think tank. Our governing council is headed by the Vice President of India, and the External Affairs Minister is its Vice President. We have three focus areas. The first is research, which is carried out by an in-house faculty. Very rigorous research of different parts of the world, encompassing the domain of area studies.
The Council has been very proactive in conducting dialogue and discussion on African affairs and India-Africa relations in order to promote an understanding on African affairs in India, an Indian perspective on Africa, given the priority that now Africa has in Indian foreign policy.
Within the Council, we have a renewed focus on Latin America and the Caribbean region. So we're looking through our studies to find new areas of cooperation such as renewable energy, climate change and the space technology.
Interacting with leading experts, diplomats, media persons and academicians has helped me nurture my research further.
We recently had the ASEAN Indo-Pacific Outlook, which has a lot of convergence with the India's own Indo-Pacific construct.
The learning curve at the Council has been tremendous and it provides a strong foundation for my future research.
The second is policy. Because we are a think tank, and being close to policy, commenting on policy, and helping formulate policy is an essential part of our functioning.
I think in the new age, what we're seeing much more of is that people want to be involved in foreign policy thinking. They want to have a voice. Now, this is where ICWA comes in.
This is the platform where I, for many years, have come and interacted with the best in the world.
ICWA provides a valued platform for visiting foreign dignitaries to interact with informed Indian audiences. The third is outreach. This is most important because of our role as a public-funded independent think tank, and we carry this out by associating ourselves with as wide an audience in India as is possible. Colleges, universities, other think tanks, and of course, with similar institutions elsewhere in the world.
What I would call the democratization of Indian foreign policy, that it has moved to distant corners of the country. It is no longer a preserve of Delhi.
ICWA has a robust publications program, which includes papers by the in-house faculty, invited papers and commentaries, and books on foreign affairs by not only former diplomats and established academics, but also by upcoming scholars. Our journal, India Quarterly, is being published since 1945. ICWA's publications are also being translated into various Indian languages. What is ICWA's role as we move into the future? The vision of the institution is to stay abreast of all the momentous changes taking place in the domain of foreign policy. New areas are emerging. There are strategic technologies, there is climate change, there is artificial intelligence, and there is cyber security. How can our research faculty and the audiences that come here be better informed about developments in these areas? How can we write and formulate research papers to give policy inputs that help in government policy formulation? These are the emerging challenges for ICWA and form a part of our vision for the future.
stabilisieren sich wieder die Situation.
A very good morning, everyone.
Oh, so.
I am Pragya Pandey, Research Fellow at the ICWA. On behalf of the Indian Council of World Affairs and Indira Gandhi National Center for Arts, New Delhi, it is my pleasure to welcome you all for this two-day webinar on roads, winds, spices in the Western Indian Ocean, the memory and geopolitics of the maritime heritage. Allow me to brief you about the program and the house rules for the webinar. The webinar will be conducted over 9 sessions today and tomorrow. This includes this morning's inaugural session, the panel discussion on Government of India's Project Mausam later this evening, and the concluding session at tomorrow evening, at which Secretary General, Indian Ocean Rim Association, the IORA, would be speaking. There will be breaks in between, and we would request you to resume your Zoom sessions in a timely way. All the panelists are to note that joining links for today and tomorrow are separate. All the participants are requested to mute themselves when they are not talking. In the sessions where we have Q&A round, chair and moderator will take the questions, and the panelists and speakers can ask questions by unmuting themselves and raise hand option. The registered participants can also ask questions live by typing through Q&A link or by the raise hand option. These will be visible to all the panelists and speakers. The chair and moderator will pose the question to the panelist and the speakers concerned. Now we are very fortunate to have with us eminent set of speakers for this inaugural session. The program shall begin with the welcome remarks by Director General, Indian Council of World Affairs, Dr. T.C.A. Raghavan, after which Professor Himanshu Prabhare, former Chairperson, National Monuments Authority, and former Professor, Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru, will deliver introductory remarks. It is our pleasure to have with us today Shri Raghvendra Singh, Secretary and CEO, Development of Museums and Cultural Spaces, Ministry of Culture, Government of India, as keynote speaker for the webinar. As an officer of Indian Administrative Service, Shri Raghvendra Singh has served in sectors of tourism and culture for over a decade and has been responsible in providing flip to the sectors of restoration and museology, which are nascent sectors in India as yet. He has headed the prestigious National Archives of India till 2017. His book, India's Lost Frontier on the Northwest Frontier Province, was released in August 2019. After the keynote address, the closing remarks will be delivered by Professor Madhu Bhalla. She is the editor of India Quarterly and former professor, Center for East Asian Studies, Delhi University. Without any further delay, may I now invite Director General, Indian Council of World Affairs, Dr. T.C.A. Raghavan, to deliver his opening remarks. Over to you.
Good morning. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Shri Raghvendra Singh, Professor Himanshu Prabhare, Professor Madhu Bhalla, and numerous colleagues. I can see many faces on the screen. We are delighted to have you with us on this platform for this inaugural session. This is, of course, a virtual conference, not out of choice. As you know, we were scheduled to be meeting in Delhi some weeks earlier, but a pandemic came in the way. But in any event, we are happy that we are able to host this conference virtually, although as we will discover, and we have already discovered to some extent, the virtual world has its own perils. A conference of this kind is a first for many of us in the Council, and I do hope we will be able to proceed without major glitches, but if there are any, please do bear with us. Let me begin with a few words about the Indian Council of World Affairs. Some details are in the conference brochure, but I want to touch very briefly at the beginning on its maritime focus. Since its establishment in the early 1940s, the world of the Indian Ocean littoral has been close to what was the original founding impulse of the Council, which is Afro-Asian solidarity. Alongside this was a growing interest in the maritime universe, and one of the well-known scholars in this field, Sardar K.M. Panikkar, was closely associated with the Council in the late 1940s and early 1950s. So some of our works of the late 1940s and early 1950s do have a maritime focus, although it has possibly been only in the past decade or so that there has been a decided shift to have a greater balance in our maritime and continental foci and research and public outreach activities. Oceans, of course, have an important place in Indian classical thinking, and seafaring communities along the vast coastline of the Indian peninsula had deep and indigenous knowledge in shipbuilding, net weaving, navigation, etc. Large Indian settlements exist all along the African coast and across Southeast Asia as a result of this intense interaction in the Indian Ocean. A growing realization that there was perhaps an excessive preoccupation with continental concerns in our strategic thinking is gradually giving way for an equibalence between the continental and the maritime, as the Indian Ocean has become one of the foremost policy priorities of our foreign policy. This is because there is a significant economic and strategic value attached to the Indian Ocean, which is one of the world's busiest trade corridors with some of the most critical sea lines of communication for global commerce. Nearly half the world's container shipments, 1/3 of the world's bulk cargo, and 2/3 of the oil shipments pass through the Indian Ocean. India's interests in the region are vast. The Indian Ocean is of vital importance to the country, given our extensive coastline of 7,500 kilometers, numerous islands, 2.4 million square kilometers of EEZ, and so on. With changing geopolitical realities, it is also important to look at the Indian Ocean in the context of the expanded maritime geography of a wider Indo-Pacific region, where India's vision stands for a free, open, and inclusive region, as was enunciated by Prime Minister Modi at the Shangri-La Dialogue in 2018. India's engagement with the littorals of the ocean is deep. Our endeavor is to strengthen relationships with regional partners in a mutually supportive and cooperative manner under the vision of Sagar. Sagar means ocean in Hindi, and Sagar is an acronym which stands for Security and Growth for All in the region, focusing on cooperation in trade, tourism, infrastructure, environment, blue economy, and security. From an analytical and scholarly perspective, there is a need to reorient dominant narratives to understand and analyze our interconnected histories, aesthetic traditions, and intellectual exchanges in secular and sacred knowledge. In this effort, this two-day webinar aims at bringing together a multidisciplinary group of academics, policymakers, diplomats, museum and heritage experts to ponder on questions like why transnational maritime cultural heritage matters, how maritime museums can popularize global narratives, can we redefine maritime connectivity and heritage, how memory and history shape the geopolitics of the Indian Ocean today, what does the maritime heritage of the Indian Ocean littoral tell us about ancient connectivity, and how does the memory of historical linkages affect our present-day worldview of connectivity of maritime linkages? These are all very complex and very broad questions, but the idea, of course, is to begin a conversation on these lines within a platform which brings together people from different disciplines. A number of different streams, therefore, flowed into this conference taking its present form. Geopolitics and heritage are the two themes that are central to it, and our conscious aim was to try to bring them closer together. Secondly, the Council has been discussing for some time now the contrasts in the two maritime spaces closest to us, the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea,
And that, of course, reflects the larger Eastern and Western Indian Ocean contrasts. These contrasts are self-evident, and I don't need to go into them, but certainly they have their impact on contemporary politics and security. But the contrasts possibly become less visible when we enter the realm of history and maritime heritage. We thought, therefore, of constructing a common platform in which historians, archaeologists, and strategic thinkers and naval analysts could come together and look in particular at the Western Indian Ocean and its limits. The third stream was provided by an important ongoing initiative of the Government of India, Project Mosam. The Indira Gandhi National Centre of the Arts readily agreed with us that a discussion on Project Mosam in a larger platform with the Ministry of External Affairs and the Indian Council of Cultural Relations would be useful. The fourth stream came from the exciting domain of maritime and naval history, and in particular, the important role that the Indian Navy has played in the strengthening of maritime heritage in India and creating a greater awareness about our maritime heritage. Finally, we thought of integrating all this into what is, for India at least, still an emerging field of maritime museums that help us bring together the past and the present together more effectively. We have benefited a great deal from our association with a number of programs and institutions. The Indian Ocean Rim Association Secretary General Voyu and Nokwe will be delivering the concluding address tomorrow. The IORA's interaction with the Council has been significant in the past few months, and I'm sure the Secretary General will touch on that in her remarks. The IORA, as you are all aware, plays an important role in institutionalizing engagements, strengthening regional cooperation and sustainable development within the Indian Ocean region. It is important to analyze the role multilateral institutions like IORA and ASEAN can play in sustaining the dynamic multilateralism for a stable and secure regional order in the Indo-Pacific region. Our continued engagement with the National Maritime Foundation and the Maritime History Society helped refine our approach and thinking about this conference. And I'm very grateful to all of the colleagues from these two institutions who are joining us. The association with IGNCA, of course, speaks with itself. And I'm sure in the future, this association will grow stronger and lead to a regular process of interaction and cooperation. We are also very happy, and I'm delighted that we have Ambassador Akhilesh Mishra, Additional Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs, who will be joining us in this conference later, and Ambassador Dinesh Patnaik, Director General of the Indian Council of World Affairs, of the Indian Council for Cultural Relations, who will also be taking part in this conference. And as I said, one idea of the conference was also to see if we can integrate Project Mosam much more coherently into the ongoing work of the Ministry of External Affairs and the Indian Council of Cultural Relations. Finally, my colleagues and I are deeply grateful to Raghvendra Singh for the time he has spent with us over the past few months in refining the contours and the approach of this conference, and certainly also for seeing how this conference will contribute further to two specific areas of his present responsibility, Project Mosam, of course, but also maritime museums in the larger context of our approach to heritage and cultural spaces. There is a great deal more to be said, but I'm sure in the sessions that follow, we will have a chance to discuss each of these aspects. I see many familiar faces in the screen in front of me, and also many familiar names, but I don't wish to take too much time in thanking all of them for joining us today and for the support they have extended to this, to our hosting this conference online. As I said, a conference of this kind is a first for us, but given the current situation, I'm sure there will be many more to follow. And I'm very grateful to all of you for joining us this morning. And I do hope we have a successful and fruitful 2 days of exchanges. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. May I now invite Professor Himanshu Prabhare, former Chairperson, National Monument Authority, to kindly deliver her introductory address.
Thank you, Pragya. May I request the first slide, please?
Yes.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted and honored to be presenting the introductory remarks. And in the 10 minutes that's allotted to me, I plan to do two things. One is I want to talk about the title of the conference. Why is it called Roads, Winds, Spices? The DG has already indicated why it focuses on the Western Indian Ocean. But I think what does need to be explained is why roads, winds, and spices. So that's one thing I'm going to do. And the second thing that I would like to do is to re-emphasize, as I see it, as an academic, as a maritime history researcher, and as somebody who has been closely involved with Project MOSM right from 2014, in what I see as the objectives of this conference. Next slide, please. So let me start by thanking at least all of you, the speakers and chairpersons, who promptly agreed to be part of this. Professor Madhu, Bhalla, editor of India Quarterly, is the co-convener of this conference. And I'm also very grateful to Dr. Kaneti for the initial help that I received. But of course, none of this academic pursuit or academic framing would have reached the stage that it has reached without the support of DG ICWA, without the support of Mrs. Mahawar, JS ICWA, and of course, our Pragya Pandey, who has worked tirelessly to make this possible. Next slide, please. So let me start with why roads, winds, spices. Roads with spices are the three terms which indicate transnational cultural heritage projects proposed to UNESCO for World Heritage nomination. The earliest of these was Roads, Silk Road, which was launched in 1988 by China. And then there were 5 other countries who participated in this. And UNESCO has been a great supporter of the Silk Road project. It was essentially to rediscover links between East and West. And in 2014, a 5,000-kilometer section of the Silk Road has actually been inscribed on the World Heritage List. So that has been one of the narratives that has been predominant as far as the Indian Ocean is concerned. Next slide, please. May I have the next slide, please? Yes, this is a map which shows, it's taken from the National Geographic, and I will have something to say about that in a moment. But this is a map which shows how China has expanded what was essentially an overland Silk Road connecting East and West to the maritime Silk routes connection. And this is, again, something which China, along with its partners, is promoting in a big way. I like this map, and I like what it indicates for several reasons. One is for the fact that we need to understand knowledge production in the 21st century and the value of publishing at universal or global platforms such as National Geographic. Clearly, I have lots to say about the fallacies in this map, but that's not my concern here. My concern here is how knowledge production gets popularized and gets across the world when it reaches a global platform. And I think we need to be aware of the intricacies of knowledge production in the present world and what this means, not just for maritime contacts, but also for our future. Next slide, please. And if you compare this map and what it says with this map, which is clearly the Chinese BRI emphases, you will see that how culture, heritage, history overlaps with political.
This is Dr. Chandralekha here, calling up from Indian Council of World Affairs.
Can I continue? I thought there was somebody in between. So this second map clearly shows the overlapping of culture and heritage with political concerns and with current concerns, not just of China, but of the entire world. Next slide, please. So let me move on to the next one. I had talked about roads. What about winds? Winds refers to the 2014 World Heritage presentation. Sorry, can I go back? Yeah, this refers to the presentation by the Ministry of Culture, Government of India, which was made to the World Heritage Committee at Doha, Qatar in 2014. And the project was proposed to the World Heritage Committee meeting. It is called Project Mausam, Maritime Routes and Cultural Landscapes. Next slide, please. What does this project hope to do and what are its ambitions? So Project Mausam essentially refers to monsoon winds, which are a unique wind system of the Indian Ocean, but it is not a project about environment or about global warming. It's a project about heritage, culture, knowledge traditions, and the way in which the monsoons created cultural corridors across the Indian Ocean, which helped connect different parts of the Indian Ocean region to each other. But more than that, which also promoted religious beliefs, music, architecture, and art, which traveled along these cultural routes. Next slide, please. Something which often gets forgotten in this whole discussion is the means of communication and the fact that we need to look at traditional boat building technologies if we are looking at a situation which is pre-colonial or pre-European, and the need to preserve many of these heritage traditions. This is just a picture of the shipbuilding yard at Mandavi, but we get references to this, and there is a lot of discussion in secondary literature on India's boat building, particularly the unique wooden boat building traditions that prevailed in the region. Next slide, please. The third one, spices. Spices is something which the Republic of Indonesia is thinking about, wanting to propose a spice trail to be recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So clearly there is lots that is being proposed for the Indian Ocean region, and we need to be aware of these cultural narratives that are being suggested and popularized. Next slide, please. So why World Heritage? Why am I so stuck with World Heritage? And what is the big advantage of thinking about World Heritage? I would argue that World Heritage provides the global platform that most countries need, because it is when monuments or transnational heritage projects get linked to World Heritage or are accepted on a global platform that they find they resonate all across the universe and all across the globe. And I have already hinted at the way in which National Geographic promotes a certain narrative of transportation and communication in the Indian Ocean. Next slide, please. So then, what were the terms of reference of Project Mausam? Was it only to talk about transnational nomination processes, only to talk about cultural roots? Certainly not. The larger terms of reference of Project Mausam was to build partnerships with scholars in the Indian Ocean region. And I think this is something which underwrites the present conference, where scholars from different parts of the Indian Ocean have come together to debate, discuss, and to talk about not just present concerns, not just about present knowledge availability, but also where are we going to take this in the future. So in addition to inscribing 2 cultural roots, I'm talking about cultural roots now, cultural roots on UNESCO's World Heritage List. This is to be in collaboration with other countries. And I think this is very, very important because as a historian, as somebody who's talked at JNU, I think it is important that we start thinking about Indian history outside the political frontiers of India and not just limit it to within India. And partnerships, building partnerships, both in political and scholarly and academic terms, I think is extremely crucial at this stage. Next slide, please. So I would end by just highlighting what the DG has already stated and what really started, excuse me, what really started this whole process. So 3 things, which are the objectives of this webinar. One is to bridge the gap between academic research, policy, and practice. And I'm well aware of this, having worked both in the university and with the Ministry of Culture. Second is to highlight the significance of past and present global maritime interactions. This is something, again, which there's a lot that needs to be done. And as I have said, that one of the ambitions of Project MOSM was to build the intellectual and the academic partnerships. And thirdly, of course, Project MOSM, the possibilities and challenges, and how are we to take this forward beyond just promoting cultural roots. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It is my pleasure now to invite Shri Raghvendra Singh, Secretary and CEO, Development of Museums and Cultural Spaces, Government of India, to kindly deliver keynote address for the webinar. So, over to you.
Can you, Pragya, can you see me? Is it?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I can see.
All right. Okay. So, in fact, let me first compliment Pragya because she's done an excellent job. There's so many people on this platform today. And despite that, there's been the sound quality, the visual quality of this whole webinar is excellent. And I think the credit should go to Pragya. Ambassador Raghavan, Professor Himanshu Prabha, Professor Madhu Bhalla, and distinguished participants. This 2-day symposium on geopolitics of maritime heritage, to my mind, I think is most timely if you take notice of this whole region, both across time and space. In fact, go further east along the Chinese coast and then come down, around Indonesia, along the Bay of Bengal, Sri Lanka, and then up to Makran coast. You will find that the political temperatures are gradually going up in this region. And they're also set to perhaps rise. There's no doubting that. The reason largely is maritime geopolitics. That is the reality of the current situation. And it is in this context that I shall be talking to you all today. Something which is more on a personal level, and that is that the government has recently created a position called the Chief Executive Officer, Development of Museums and Cultural Spaces. And I'm the first incumbent in that job. Now this is a very, this is a new position, keeping in mind the requirements, especially in terms of museums and developing cultural spaces. What usually happens is that various state governments or even central ministries or various arms of the public sector, they go ahead and create museums. They get funding, but really they don't have that kind of expertise to do it. So what the government is attempting to do is to create expertise on museums, and the government has actually great plans for it. In fact, the government plans to create a new national museum, which will actually be divided into 2 sections and would be housed in a very, very how should I put it, in a grand building or grand buildings, and the area given to it would be exponentially large than what the National Museum currently occupies. So therefore, if we are to raise our levels and bars of what the museums are over here in India, we have to develop in-house expertise and especially create skilled personnel in areas like curation, conservation, visitor experience, and so on and so forth. Now coming back to the talk, a vital feature of the Indian Ocean is the Indian subcontinent that juts out for about 1,000 miles, and it tapers off at Kanyakumari. India and Indian Ocean have been inextricably linked by geography and history. The sphere of this ocean extends from East Africa to Tasmania and from Asia to Antarctica. The Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, the Arabian Sea, the Bay of Bengal, and several islands are all part of this extension. This region has been a cradle of several civilizations, major religions and faiths of the world, be it Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, Jainism, and Islam are all represented in the littoral and island nations of the Indian Ocean. Geography exerts great influence on politics and security, particularly in matters maritime. It is in this context that the geography of Indian Ocean acquires importance. On its waters are carried, as Ambassador Raghavan also just reiterated, half the world's container shipments, 1/3 of the bulk cargo traffic, and about 2/3 of oil shipments. Among its geographical features are the Cape of Good Hope, the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, the entrance of Red Sea, the Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, and Sunda Strait between Sumatra and Java. About 1/3 of the world's population inhabits the littoral states and islands of the Indian Ocean. 4 of these countries have populations in excess of 140 million people: India, Pakistan, Indonesia, and Bangladesh. Millennium before Columbus sailed the Atlantic and Magellan crossed the Pacific, the Indian Ocean was an active thoroughfare of cultural and commercial traffic. It was around 45 AD that discovery was made on how to use the monsoon winds to directly cross the Arabian Sea instead of hugging the coast. The Indian navigators, of course, had already sailed and discovered Socotra long before 1st century AD. In fact, they had navigated the Red Sea using the magnetic needle, they call it as Matsya Yantra, for determination. The existence of prosperous Hindu colonies in Malaya, Sumatra, Java, Cambodia, and modern-day Vietnam clearly indicates that the Bay of Bengal had been mastered long before the 1st century AD. That peninsular India was maritime in its tradition is borne out by the writings of Fahian, who visited India around 400, 410 AD. He was transported through sea from Sri Lanka to Sri Vijaya, along with 200 merchants, all of whom professed the Brahmanical religion. There are numerous other references to the Mauryas and the Andhras with regard to the eastern seas. The Chinese had actually an extensive sea trade along the Malabar coast. This trade being there during the Tang dynasty period with Calicut. When Singh, who visited India in 7th century AD, describes the vast overseas trade during the Gupta period. There are then numerous mentions of the Chola emperors and their powerful seafaring capacity. Using biannual monsoons, the eastbound shipping from the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf regularly visited South India. During summer months, the prevailing wind system of Indian Ocean blows from southwest, As a result, sailing used to be suspended from May until September along the west coast of India, as well as the South Arabian coast. A reversal would take place around October. The northeast monsoon dominated between November and April. The Red Sea had its own pattern of wind system, which did not coincide with the monsoon. The ancient vessels that left the Red Sea ports in July must have attempted to reach the Indian ports before September. The return voyage took place between November and April, with the beginning of northeast monsoon. The Roman ships, of course, made passages to India during the monsoons when all other shipping was closed, perhaps because they had their Roman crafts which were sturdily constructed. Then, of course, as Professor Himanshu Prabha mentioned about another aspect, which is the aspect of the spice route, is the name given to the sea routes that link the east with the west, which stretch from the west coast of Japan through islands of Indonesia, India, and the land of Middle East, and from there across the Mediterranean to the Europe. The links were formed by traders through buying and selling from port to port. Since they traded majorly in spices, the route was named the spice route. The use of monsoon winds in the Indian Ocean was a boon to sailing ships. It helped them in their travels to and from India. Artifacts of Indus Valley civilization have been found in Middle East and Egypt dating back to almost 5,000 years ago. Large colonies of Romans lived in the port cities of India, especially on the east coast in Tamil Nadu in the first millennium. In fact, I just recently been to Arikamedu, which is near Pondicherry, and it has a huge amount of archaeological remains present. And if one takes up excavation there, again, we can come up with some fantastic artifacts. Some of the earliest seafaring ships plied between the coast of Kerala and the Middle East. The second oldest mosque, in fact, in the world was constructed in Kodungalur in Kerala. Buddhism spread to all corners of Asia through sea and land routes. Centers like Sukhothai, Ayodhya, Angkor Wat in the east, or Swat, Bamiyan, or Dunhuang on the western side of India are manifestations of the vibrant cultural links of India with the regions around the Indian Ocean region. Ramayana was perhaps the most popular story told in this region. The Hindu and Buddhist traditions provide some of the finest paintings, sculptures, and relief across Asia. Historians and archaeologists in this region have focused largely on land-based concerns. Consequently, the cultural heritage that drove maritime connectivity and which related to the large rubric of geopolitics have been ignored. There's a need, therefore, to create a universally accepted and understood historical narrative of maritime connectivity, the kind of mandate which perhaps Project Mosam has. The answer lies in utilizing the UNESCO's World Heritage Platform. A large number of World Heritage sites are located on the coasts across the Western Indian Ocean. How does one then bring them into dialogue with each other and build partnerships on the basis of shared maritime heritage? That's the question. Some examples of commonality could be based on the Dho culture of the Indian Ocean, the research and analysis of sea stories circulating in the Western Indian Ocean in different languages, or the great body of literature on the origin of major crops, archaeological remains of which suggest contacts across the Western Indian Ocean, then the transport of food on account of shortage, trade in spices, the language seafarers communicated in. In fact, they could all result in, in fact, building major partnerships. Archaeological exploration in Socotra at the mouth of the Red Sea led to the discovery of more than 200 drawings, in fact, dating from the 2nd to 4th century AD. Of these, 192, to be precise, are in Brahmi script, one in Kharoshti, one in Bactrian, 3 in Greek, and 1 in Aramaic. Socotra has been, of course, inscribed on the World Heritage List as a natural site in 2008. But the building of transnational maritime network In fact, since 2014, when it got announced, has received little attention from academics or policymakers. In fact, Socotra hardly finds any mention, as also several other coastal World Heritage sites across the Western Indian Ocean that show evidence of maritime activity. In fact, in Ajanta Caves, the narrative of Simhala, a seafaring merchant, who's prominently depicted. He was, as we all know, the incarnation of Shakyamuni Gautama, and he, along with 500 merchants, had landed in Tamradweep, which is current Sri Lanka. This is an interesting story with a great Sri Lanka Connect. There's also a great scope of collaboration among maritime museums. Several countries in the Indian Ocean have already established a collaboration, with the Maritime Museum being set up at Lothal in India would in fact prove very useful. India's focus towards the East and South have actually resulted in not highlighting its historical connections. Perhaps it's been at that expense across Africa, the Middle East, and Southern Europe. India should aim to revive its maritime ties among the Indian Ocean ports of Kerala and Gujarat with Sri Lanka and the Gulf Cooperation Council countries such as Oman, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia. While inaugurating the Kochi Metro in 2017, in fact, Prime Minister Modi had called Kochi the Queen of the Arabian Sea, an important spice trading center. Kerala should find a specific role in Project Mawsum. A major goal should be to revive the historical spice route in a large geopolitical and geoeconomic context. We had launched the Project Mawsum to sustain cross-national connectivity with East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, the Indian subcontinent, Sri Lanka, and the Southeast Asian archipelagos. But how does one translate? That's the main challenge. How does one translate Project Mawsum into feasible projects like what the Maritime Silk Road or One Belt, One Road projects have actually come to be? More than 36 countries have been identified as partners in the new WINDS project, Project Mawsum. Trade should actually be a major concern given the fact that Gulf cooperation countries are India's biggest trading partners. India's trade diversification as well as free trade arrangements have affected the export potential of spices from Kerala. The international market of spice has also witnessed new players. Project Mawsum may be used to revive Kerala's spice trade route. In fact, it should seek to reestablish Kerala's maritime connectivity with countries it had exchanges with. India, in fact, has a vast human resource already in existence in many Gulf countries. This is a major source of soft power, which India should make use of. India is a signatory, as we all know, to various UNESCO conventions. Project Mawsum was to provide a platform across the Indian Ocean world through cross-cultural transnational narrative. It was to seek a transnational nomination under World Heritage by highlighting links of the Indian Ocean maritime route. This will provide visibility to connectivity, encourage research, encourage tourism, also develop heritage. The project will navigate through coastal architecture, through maritime heritage and artifacts, through maritime museums, underwater cultural heritage, industrial heritage, shipbuilding, intangible cultural heritage, trade routes, cultural products, pilgrimage, religious travel, oral traditions, and literary writings. There are just so many aspects actually one has the opportunity of dealing with on the Project Mawsum platform. Against this backdrop, in fact, this two-day conference which we are having on maritime heritage should be used to draft or chart a timeline for this project. The idea is to formalize subjects based upon which Project Mawsum may be executed. A possible way forward could be to begin collecting data on historical exchanges in the field of both tangible and intangible maritime cultural heritage. This may include pathways related to art, philosophy, mathematics, geography, and sciences. No project of this kind actually exists at this moment. Scholars and experts across the region should examine the implications jointly. Indian Council of World Affairs actually should collaborate with the Ministry of Culture and other partners towards this end. This research then should feed in to proposing to UNESCO for a World Heritage of the outcome of this initiative, and also place the maritime cultural heritage of the Indian Ocean on a firm and independent footing. This should be done actually separately. The project should also have both cultural and serious strategic dimensions, to my mind. India should consider including Andaman and Nicobar Islands also within this ambit, given the island's location close to the Straits of Malacca and Thailand. The purpose behind Project Mosam should be to remind the region as to why the ocean is called the Indian Ocean. The project should be made more meaningful so that it does not lack teeth. The Maritime Silk Route, ladies and gentlemen, is an initiative which is already impacting the strategic balance in the Indian Ocean region. It's known to everyone that MSR strives for an influence in the Indian Ocean. The new geopolitics of the Indian Ocean region is defined by America's declining influence. The old age geopolitics of the Indian Ocean region, characterized by the US hegemony as a leading force from the Middle East to the Pacific, is now giving way to a new geopolitics as America's focus shifts gradually from the Indian Ocean. India and Australia have maritime presence in the Indian Ocean, along with Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan. But in this region, the political competition is now shifting from land to sea. Maritime rivalry in this region may intensify. If United States continues to diminish its influence in the Indian Ocean, which country is supposed to replace it? The power vacuum left by America's retreat needs to be compensated by a concerted effort by various other countries to maintain a strategic balance in the Indian Ocean region. Though India's economy is the biggest in this region, China is the biggest user of its sea lanes. The MSR initiative is an indication of increasing realization of the growing salience of the Indian Ocean. MSR is aimed at allowing China's maritime military power to break free from the geographical constraints of the Western Pacific island chains. Over 60% of China's oil imports transit via the Indian Ocean. Even as China builds pipelines through Myanmar and Pakistan, they would be quite inadequate to mitigate its energy insecurity. Maritime Silk Route is China's crucial element of grand strategy to carve out a Chinese sphere of influence in an area where the American presence is ebbing. Many countries in the Indian Ocean region endorse the MSR idea because it comes with economic incentives, thus softening China's maritime rise. The MSR tends to negate the anxiety caused on account of rapid expansion of the Chinese Navy and also negates the string of pearls theory. Not all of India's merchandise trade transit via the sea. Land-based trade routes are unlikely to come up in the near future. India would necessarily have to rely on international shipping lanes. Security and safety of shipping would remain a paramount concern for many years to come. The critical question is whether the Maritime Silk Route shall impair this safety. In what way could MSR harm India's freedom of navigation in this region? The ultimate goal of China is to acquire maritime hegemony in the Indian Ocean, thus raising its global image and ensuring energy security. The MSR belongs only to China. MSR has a potentiality of turning into a battlefield for maritime hegemony as China possesses the power to claim it. China uses diplomacy to expand its global footprint. India has been apprehensive of China's role in building outposts around its periphery. MSR highlights Sri Lanka's position on the east-west sea route where China, the economic and military interests fuse. Wadar, Hambantota, Kyu, and Chittagong validate this argument. The Belt Road Initiative and the MSR have onboarded approximately more than 65 countries. For Project Mosam, about 39 countries have been identified for transnational nomination for World Heritage, but no partnership have still been entered into. There are no major or minor research projects yet that deal with Project Mosam. The initiative of China were first converted into strategy and thereafter put into action. China has used its full diplomatic abilities to bring the academia, media, museums, and governmental apparatus to ensure the successful implementation of Belt Road and MSR initiatives. In comparison, Project Mosam is still in the phase of just being an initiative, limited currently to research, conferences, seminars on cultural linkages between India and other countries. The Chinese initiative is a comprehensive one, whereas Project Mosam just deals with cultural dimensions. Belt Road and MSR, ladies and gentlemen, offer thousands of scholarships, hold art and film festivals, book fairs, make it convenient for people to apply for tourist visas, cooperate on epidemic information, cooperate on treatment technologies, public health emergencies, technology transfer, maritime cooperation, cooperation among cities and among non-governmental organizations. Project Mosam, on the other hand, is yet to promote understanding on common heritage and multiple identities. Project Mosam is yet to seek to revive lost linkages, provide cross-cultural, transnational narrative, and evolve a relationship between natural and cultural heritage. The Chinese initiative is a national initiative, whereas Project can at best be regarded as an Indian Cultural Ministry's research project. Even this research project is limited to an assigned group only. Project Mosam is yet to broaden its reach and scope, even within India, through interdisciplinary approach to be implemented by various institutes, universities, departments, and interested academicians. It is in fact challenging for India to convince the world about the seriousness of our own project. The Chinese initiative is quite popular among academicians, both inside and outside China. For a researcher interested in Project Mosam, it is a challenge to get funding from the government or universities. We should build a well thought out and coherent strategy to execute Project Mosam. This requires a background study for better implementation and success of the strategy. How can Project Mosam help to rejuvenate and reclaim India's status on a global scale? How can Project Mosam result in better economic integration along the Indian Ocean region? That, my dear friends, is actually a challenge we should overcome immediately. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your enriching remarks. May I now invite Professor Madhu Bhalla, Editor India Quarterly, to deliver closing remarks for the session. Ma'am.
Sure. Thank you very much for this wonderful session. Actually, it was very good to hear many concerns around Project Mosam because it has seemed to us, many of us who have been looking at it for some time, that the idea is more honored in its absence, really, right? But I think looking at the discussions that we've had today, Professor Ray's comments and then Mr. Raghvendra's comments, the Mosam project has the potential to be alive and kicking, it seems to me. And I think it's good that we have come together in this conference to talk not just about Mosam project, Mosam initiative, but also about it in the wider context of heritage and how we can actually look at where we place Indian heritage in the UNESCO listing. I'd just like to say a couple of things about the MOSM initiative. Actually, in the ICWA, we have very recently submitted an entire volume, an issue of the India Quarterly, dedicated to MOSM, the MOSM initiative. And the reason we did that was because we felt, both Himanshu and I felt, that ever since Himanshu first went to present the dossier at Doha in 2016, there has not actually been much movement on thinking about what MOSM initiative would mean, its objectives, its scope. And looking at the IGNCA's website, we found that there were very limited, that it was actually being discussed in a very limited framework. Whereas from our perspective, the MOSM initiative has an immense initiative and immense scope. The problem, it seems to me, is that there hasn't been very clear thinking about what the MOSM initiative can do and where it should be going. So therefore, in a sense, it hasn't met the expectations with which it was announced, nor does it have the programmatic framework, a very clear programmatic framework. So little clarity on how the ancient, medieval, pre-modern histories of the Indian Ocean can resonate with our times and with our concerns. I think what was very interesting in Mr. Raghavendra's discussion, his presentation, was that from his perspective, MOSM initiative, one of the objectives of MOSM initiative is actually to reflect India's heritage and India's history and India's influence in the Indian Ocean. And that, of course, may well be the objective of the MOSM initiative as a soft power initiative. But I think if you want to put a soft power initiative into practice and for it to be successful, I think the overlay of an aggressive Indian initiative in the Indian Ocean may not be the best way to. Perhaps the best way to do this is to actually seek partnerships. You mentioned that under the MOSM initiative, the Ministry of Culture actually has listed 39 states that it would like to deal with in the MOSM initiative. And yet, since 2016 to now, none of these states have actually come on board. One of the reasons, of course, is that when the MOSM initiative was announced, it wasn't just China that looked askance at the MOSM initiative. It was also much more benign partners like the ASEAN, for example, who questioned India's ownership of the Indian Ocean. And they actually put out a statement saying that India should consider other stakeholders in the Indian Ocean when it actually puts out this initiative. So what we are looking at really is the absence of a view that we need a proper partnership with other states, not just to say to them, this is India's ocean, this is India's initiative, but that this is a joint initiative of all stakeholders in the Indian Ocean. Secondly, is the MOSM initiative a project? Is it a MOSM project or is it an initiative?
मैं अभी एक सेमिनार में हूँ, आप दोबारा फोन करिएगा.
Yeah, okay. So is it a project or is it an initiative? I think the lines are sort of blurred in this. The project was to get it listed as in the UNESCO heritage site. The initiative is a much larger framework which should have a larger vision and we should have a larger objective. And I think here the lines between the two are not very clearly drawn. So very often we end up talking about UNESCO heritage listing and we assume that that is the entire MOSM initiative as we take it. The problem is that when we talk about the MOSM project, the MOSM initiative as a MOSM project, it becomes time-bound, and the Ministry of Culture has actually done that. It was time-bound till 2017, they have now extended it to this year. It is also bound in terms of its finances, so that what we're looking at is not a long-term commitment to an initiative that will, in the long run, serve India's soft power interests and also its objectives in its foreign policy, but as a very instrumental kind of a project that will just place Indian heritage on a UNESCO heritage site. I think that objective You may well meet that objective, but you will never then meet the objective of the MOSM initiative, which is a much longer soft power objective as we go ahead. The other thing, of course, is who's the audience for the initiative? Is the audience people at home? Is the audience the IGNCA? Is it the National Museums? Is it ICWA? Who is the audience? I think the audience for the MOSM initiative are all the Indian Ocean littoral countries. And we are actually not speaking to them through this MOSM initiative at all. So we need to actually frame our discourse around this initiative. We need to frame the strategies of partnership around this initiative so that we actually speak to the audience that it is important for us to have on board in this initiative. So we need to define who the stakeholders are. I don't think we can make up a list of 39 countries without thinking about which countries have a larger stake in the Indian Ocean littoral culture or history or heritage. So we do need experts to be able to do that. I don't think that anybody who doesn't know the maritime history of this area of the region, or anybody who doesn't know, the monuments and the artifacts and the technologies that have evolved in this region over many centuries, will be able to actually define what these 39 countries should be. So really, we need to be able to define our audience very clearly. We need to be able to actually decide that our audience is larger than ourselves. It's not just ourselves, it's not just India that's going out there to achieve an objective. It's everybody who's a stakeholder in the Indian Ocean littoral becoming part of a MOSM initiative. We have to also ask why, why does the MOSM initiative become troublesome? Why have people raised their eyebrows at this? Why are countries not coming on board? I think one of the issues is an ownership issue. As I said, Indian ownership of the project, even if narrowly defined as transcribing transnational heritage, comes up against reservations over the privileged position of Indian context and cultural focus on Indian art and heritage. The second thing is, whose Indian Ocean are we talking about? There are very many views about the Indian Ocean. In fact, very many countries look at the Indian Ocean differently. Across history, we have found that the Indian Ocean has never had a stable nomenclature. Periplus called it the Erythraean Sea. The Persians, when they were very powerful and they had a powerful empire, called it the Sea of Fars. The Arabs have often called it the Sea of India and China, and they've actually lumped India and China together in one landmass. So we are looking at differing perspectives, different perceptions of what the Indian Ocean itself is. And I think we need to have that debate with all the Indian Ocean littoral countries. How do they see the Indian Ocean? Sri Lanka, for example, has historically seen this as an unbounded ocean, something that is not divided into the Bay of Bengal, the Eastern and the Western Indian Oceans. So how are we actually looking at this? Who is deciding what the definition of this Indian Ocean is? And I think that's very important, because if the naming of the Indian Ocean was unstable in history, the perspectives on the Indian Ocean are also unstable today. The interesting part is that, and I think Rila Mukherjee's paper will discuss that in the latter part of the conference, but even in India, our idea of the ocean has never been a stable idea. Whether it was Samudra, whether it was Sagar, whether it was a riverine areas, whether it was a coastal areas, whether it was a deep sea, all of this has changed over time. So in a sense, I think if you're going to be looking at history, if you're going to go back to history and come back from that into more contemporary concerns, we need to take all of these different perspectives of what the Indian Ocean is, what it means to different peoples around the littoral, I think very seriously. The other thing, of course, is other contradiction, I think, in the Indian Ocean, in the MOSM initiative is that, and this is a very deep contradiction, the state holds the funding, but the work has actually to be done outside of the state. The work to make the MOSM initiative a credible initiative to provide the strategies, to provide the ballast, to provide the foundations for thinking about MOS initiative is to be provided by archaeologists, by historians, by linguists, by people, by literators, so that in a sense there has to be a coming together of the non-state actors in this project. And that really, I think, is not happening to any great extent right now. Partly because the project has been defined, I think, very narrowly, partly because its activities have been defined very narrowly, partly because there is no clarity in whether it's a project, it's to be it's just a UNESCO listing, or does it have a larger vision? So in a sense, this deep contradiction, I think, has to be bridged. And I think what Shri Raghvendra said about, this has to be an all of the people initiative, actually. It's all of the state initiative, actually. And finally, I'd like to say, and I think this is really important, I think instead of pushing the Indian angle a great deal on this, instead of ensuring that everybody knows that India is influential in the Indian Ocean, I think we have to go back and look at the history of the Indian Ocean communities as cosmopolitan communities. Right? I think we have to understand that the dynamism of the Indian Ocean world actually came from this cosmopolitanism. It actually came from the movement of scholars, it came from the movement of travelers, it came from the movement of ideas, it came from the huge translation projects in Baghdad, for example, where Sanskrit, Chinese, Arab, Greek books were translated. And in a way, it created what I would call, I suppose, an Indian Ocean ecumene. I think that does not exist today. And if we are going to impose on the MOSIM initiative in a very upfront manner, if you will, the sense that this is going to serve only India's initiative, we are not going to get that response that will help us to create a much more cosmopolitan debate on the Indian Ocean region. The advantage of cosmopolitan communities and cosmopolitanism as an idea is that it works outside of the structures of power and structures of hierarchy. They may still exist, obviously they will still exist, but to a large extent the conversation can be held outside of those structures. And when I say a cosmopolitan community, what I'm also saying is that we need to rethink both our view of the Indian Ocean, we need to rethink what our definition of the concerns around the Indian Ocean littoral. What, for example, is the meaning of diaspora, say, in South Africa? And what is the meaning of diaspora, say, in Western India? Right? What is the meaning of slavery and race, for example? Across history, around that history. And what is the meaning of different communities as they have emerged along the Indian Ocean littoral? So in a sense, I think cosmopolitan idea is something that we need to revive. We need, whether we revive the trade, whether we revive the historical trade, that's a separate thing, and that will very well be revived. But I think that if we want to deepen this conversation, if we want to have this conversation at all, we have to have a much more cosmopolitan view of what it is we want from the MOSIM initiative. So in a sense, I suppose what I'm saying is that we had habits of communication in the Indian Ocean region which have lapsed. Especially since the coming of the modern world, the pre-modern world, colonialism, they have completely lapsed. We need to revive those habits of communication. We need to read the literature that is being written in South Africa, in Nigeria, in Kenya. I think that is very rare in India today. Unless you make an absolute effort, you will never get any stuff in Indian bookstores, about what writers in South Africa or Nigeria or in Kenya are writing about. Unless the West discovers them first, and then they come to us. But on our own, the connection is not between India and Africa. The other thing I want to say is, very often we talk about the Indian Ocean world and we think about the Arab trade, but I think we need to bring Africa in. And I think Shri Raghavendra put this very well, that we need to bring Africa into this in a much more concerted fashion, right? because all the movement was not just north and south, it was also east and west. So we also had communities of Siddhis, for example, living in Maharashtra, Gujarat, right? And we also have in the Swahili area, for example, artifacts that indicate not just trade, but that people in that region were buying commodities that amounted to luxury and gifts because there was an appreciation of Indian art quite apart from what was being traded. So what we are looking at is, the fact that we have shut out from our consciousness a large part of the world that is very, very intrinsic to how people lived in the Indian Ocean communities. And finally, I think, we really need to look at a more specific thing. We talk about culture and we talk about intellectuals and we talk about the movement of ideas, but I think we need to bring these down to the areas in which they were produced, because the Indian Ocean littoral had a whole range of what I call great centers of learning. And these great centers of learning were extremely cosmopolitan. They produced secular knowledges, they produced religious knowledge, but they also, what they did was actually they set up a system of grading knowledge and in the sense of classifying knowledge into different disciplines. And these, I think, became the precursors of the Western university system at some point. But these great centers of learning, I think, are something that we should revive, an interest in that we should revive, because in the sense, when we talk of the movement of ideas, this is where they moved out from, this is where they moved into. So in a sense, I agree with Shri Raghvendra that we need actually a dedicated research project to be able to open out many of the aspects of the MOSM initiative. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your remarks. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll now take a short break for 10 minutes and reconvene at 11:25 hours for the session 1 on popularizing global narratives. Thank you.
But Pragya, who's going to give us tea?